And just to let you know, this event is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel within a couple of days. So we're going to record this session and be uploaded in a couple of days. Now, I think everyone's used Zoom before, but if you haven't used Zoom before, well, we will take questions and answers after the presentation is over using the chat function. So there's a little box on your screen, and normally on the bottom right corner, it says chat, C-H-A-T. And that's where you go to ask a question, which we'll deal with after the presentation is over. So we're going to hear from the speaker first, and then take questions using the chat function after he has finished speaking, which will be for about roughly 50 minutes, maybe an hour or so. So just in case you've never heard of Black History Walks before, what we do is we organize guided history walks all over London in 15 different areas. Could be north, east, south, west, and we've been doing this for about 15 years or so. So every month of the year, there's normally a walk taking place. Could be in Bloomsbury, Soho, Brixton, Docklands, Hackney, Mayfair. We take people around and show them all the African Caribbean history that's in the streets in those areas. Coming soon, we have our Black History River Cruise. So 9th of July, Saturday, 2 o'clock, excuse me, we have a 3-hour tour on the river that goes from Embankment up to Vauxhall, down to Greenwich and back. And it gives you all the history that you can find in the river itself and also on either side of the river. And apart from that, we have characters dressed up in costume representing real heroes from Black history on board the ship, or boat rather, to tell you who they are, where they're from. So it's a very kind of interesting, interactive experience. Hopefully be a nice sunny day, depending on British weather, 9th of July. And there are tickets available now, and you can check out from my website. Our website is just blackhistorywalks.co.uk. It's just blackhistorywalks.co.uk. Now, half term is coming up, and one thing we hear a lot from parents is that there's not enough Black history content for kids who are at school or who are off school. So every half term we have the same issue, that a lot of children of African Caribbean descent don't have access to provision of amazing, powerful, positive Black images. So what we have done, we teamed up with a cinema called the Phoenix Cinema, which is about 5 stops from King's Cross. So it's about probably 7 stops on King's Cross. And the cinema itself is literally 2 minutes walk from the tube station. So from King's Cross, it's about, I think, 7 stops. And then from the tube station itself, it's like 2 minutes walk. And we have 2 whole days of nothing but African Caribbean science fiction superheroes. So 2nd of June, we have something called African Superheroes Day, and it does what it says in the tin. We have like a good 2.5 hours of nothing but Black superheroes. And I don't just mean Black Panther, because there's at least 80 Black female superheroes that will go from the day. Plus, what we do on that day is we look at some of the Marvel movies and we show you the real Black history in those Marvel movies that's not acknowledged. So a lot of the films that you see from Marvel, be it Thor or Spider-Man, wherever it is, actually they quite often borrow from African mythology, African history. And the 2nd of June, we're gonna go through some of that history that's been borrowed and not recognized, plus looking at some African superheroes from Africa, from the Caribbean, and also from Britain. And speaking of Black British superheroes, did you know there's a Black British superhero couple? So on the 3rd of June, the Friday, that is, after Thursday, we have Black British superheroes, Spirit of Pharaoh, and Caribbean science fiction. We'll be showing films and animations that were made with Black characters set in the Caribbean or indeed in London. So you got 2 events to look forward to if you got kids, and it's good for adults too. And as far as the Superheroes Day is concerned, we've been running that for about 10 years now altogether. So long before the current kind of world got started about superheroes, we're into this sort of thing. Also, if you're a fan of Black British films, there's a man called Menelik Shabazz, absolute legend when it comes to creating amazing dramas, documentaries about the Black experience in this country. And we're going to have a whole day of his films, looking back at his work. It's going to be a retrospective. And that's taking place on the 25th of June at the BFI South Bank. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to choose from if you're interested. It could be an animated film, it could be a live action film, a drama, etc. and we show these sort of films all year long for the last 15 years. This is an example of the kind of super we're going to be looking at on the Thursday. I wonder if anyone knows who this sister is. Well, if you want to find out, come on Thursday, 2nd of June at the Thing at Cinema up in North London. These are some more superheroes. You can see the sister right there in the center is of African descent. So basically on that day, we'll be going for all these kind of amazing Black superheroes from America, Brazil, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, etc., the UK, giving giving you where to find out more about them, and also telling the stories of African history used in mainstream Hollywood movies. Oh, here's a little sample, little trailer for one of the things we're going to be showing. All right, so that was a trailer for one of the films we'll be showing on the 2nd and the 3rd of June at the Phoenix Cinema. Phoenix Cinema is up in North London, not far from the tube station, as I mentioned before. I should mention Robin Walker's excellent book, which is about 600 pages of amazing ancient African history. And the thing is, when it comes to Spirit of the Pharaoh, what you find is that the director, the designer, the author of that book, which is also a graphic novel, has used real African history to create his boyfriend and girlfriend, husband and wife superhero team. So when you watch the cartoon, the animation Spirit of the Pharaoh, when you read the graphic novel Spirit of the Pharaoh, you're actually ingesting real, serious African history. And in the past, we've actually teamed up with Robin Walker to do kind of a showcase of the Spirit of the Pharaoh movie, animation franchise, etc., but also to look at the real Black history, African history, in that franchise. So we'll be doing it again in the future. So check out Robin Walker's book, When We Ruled, which is a massive book looking at nothing but ancient African history long before European arrival. So you saw this before if you're on time, but these are some of the events we have coming up. I mentioned 2 of them. You got a walk in Soho, you got How Black Lives Matter Makes Black Culture Matter, you got Black History and Get Images, New Resources, that's coming up. You also have Call of Duty, the Black History Breakdown, which is going to be a very interesting breakdown on how Call of Duty, the very well-known action gaming franchise, has used a whole bunch of real Black history in its characters, in its kind of stories. But again, we'll be going through some of the different iterations of Call of Duty and showing you exactly which character, which scene is referencing real Black history. Got a couple of walks coming up too. You got the Hackney Walk, the Harlem and Mayfair Walk, the Notting Hill Walk, etc. Plus the Black History Bus Tour. So next Black History Bus Tour, which is 3 hours long, goes around London, is going to be the 17th of July. So if you're interested, just go to our website, blackhistorywalks.co.uk, and check out these events. But today, we're here to talk about this amazing woman, Evelyn Dove, Britain's Black Cabaret Queen. So this presentation is brought to you by Black History Walks, but it's presented by a young man called Stephen Bourne. Now, if you don't know who Stephen Bourne is, let me tell you a little bit about this guy, right? Oh, before I do that, I did say this is going to be recorded, right? So the recording will be on this YouTube channel. This YouTube channel is called youtube.com/Black History Walks. So the recording of this event will be placed here on this YouTube channel, and the channel's name is youtube.com/Black History Walks. So give it a couple of days, and this conversation will be listed on youtube.com/Black History Walks. And this is actually an archive. It's an archive you can access for free. And it has about 200 long to short videos from 5 minutes to 2 hours, 40 minutes rather, looking at different aspects, of Black British history in particular. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff and you want to check out our 15-year archive, go to this website, youtube.com/Black History Walks. You can see some of our previous lectures and other clips, etc., from our long history of showing Black films and doing Black history events. youtube.com/Black History Walks. But let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Stephen Bourne. Now, the man's written at least 20 books over the last 30 years, right? All these books cover, on the whole, mostly marginalized or ignored history to do with African Caribbean people. This man has covered areas which nobody else has covered. The most recent book we can refer to is one called Deep Are the Roots, Trailblazers Who Changed Black British Theatre. There's no other book like it on the market. Stephen Bourne researched this over 30 years, actually met a lot of the actual actors, directors, and producers of these theatre shows and actually film shows sometimes, and created a book from his experiences, from his research. That's one of his books. Black Poppies, for example, is about Black people in World War I. There's a whole massive compilation of his books, some of which you can see here. But suffice to say, Mr. Bourne has done an amazing amount, a very detailed amount of research into Black history. And you should definitely get Deep at the Roots if you're interested in theatre. But you can also get the book on which this talk is based, which is Evelyn Dove by Stephen Bourne. So Stephen Bourne is going to talk for about 50 minutes about Evelyn Dove and his knowledge of her and the other people that she's linked into when it comes to Black British theatre history. And after he's spoken about 50 minutes or so, we'll take some questions using the chat function. But without further ado, let me stop sharing and hand over to Mr. Stephen Bourne. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. I just want to get my...
Oh, it's looking good. Yeah.
It's looking good. I'm learning.
Just make it full screen. You'll be good to go.
I hate technology, but Tony, you are making it easier for me to understand, and I'm not as young as you think I am. Thank you so much, Tony, for this return visit to talk about my passion, which is Black British history. Evelyn Dove, I mean, as you've already said in your introduction, and also thank you to all of you that have signed in this evening. It's lovely to have you on board. Yeah, I have been writing Black British history books for 30 years. It's been an incredible journey. It's had its ups and downs, but I've persevered, and I certainly never expected to write a book about Evelyn, but I will explain how that came about later on in the talk. Evelyn was once known as the closest rival of Josephine Baker. Evelyn was indeed an international star in the 1920s and 30s. When I started hearing her name and finding out little snippets of information about her, I was intrigued. But with any aspect of Black British history, at least I'm talking about the 1980s now, I'm going back sort of over 35 years, when I first started to learn about her, there was very little information about anyone who was Black and British in our history. So it was very, very difficult, but I persevered. So Evelyn Dove was one of the true pioneers of the booming cabaret age of the 1920s. She thrilled audiences around the world, and her exquisite stage costumes helped to make her one of the most glamorous women of her time. And we have to put this into the context of the dominance of African-American women in show business. Josephine Baker, who I've already mentioned, those that came to Britain like Elizabeth Welch and Adelaide Hall. I mean, I don't want to say there was competition, but there certainly were not that many opportunities for someone like Evelyn. But she was a trailblazer. She was an adventuress who just struck out and forged her own path. So she was a Black British siren who toured Europe throughout the 20s and 30s, courting admirers and fans wherever she performed. Her mesmerizing movie star looks and grace captivated those in her presence. The public and press couldn't get enough of the rising star, who went on to replace Josephine Baker as the star attraction in a review at the famous Casino de Paris in 1932. In 1936, amidst a frenzy of public interest, she became the first Black British singer to try and conquer America. No mean feat. And this was 25 years before Shirley Bassey conquered America in the early 1960s. Evelyn headlined a cabaret show at New York's popular Connie's Inn, which rivaled the Cotton Club as a showcase for the best in Black talent. However, Evelyn was unsuccessful at winning over American audiences. Black and white American audiences did not take to a sophisticated Black Englishwoman who sang a repertoire of songs in French, German, and Italian. At that time, they expected a Black woman to sing either upbeat jazz numbers or tear their hearts out with the blues. In fact, Evelyn was further disadvantaged from the start. At Connie's Inn, she had to follow the enormously popular Billie Holiday, who had just scored a big success at Connie's Inn with her show Stars Over Broadway, in which she co-starred with the legendary Louis Armstrong. The personalities and singing styles of Evelyn and Billie could not have been more different. But Evelyn's career was one of many highs and lows, but at the height of her fame in the 1920s and 30s, she was a young adventuress who refused to be constrained by her race and English middle-class background. Evelyn was mixed race, born into privilege in London in 1902 to a West African father and an English mother. Her father, Franz Dove, was born in Sierra Leone into a wealthy family, and in the 1890s, he spent a great deal of time in London studying law. He married Evelyn's mother, Augusta, in 1896. Now, there was a brother that I want to talk about. The brother was Frank. Her older brother, Frank, was born in 1897. I just want to slightly divert. I'm going to read from my book, Black Poppies, because Frank's story is in there, the story of the Black servicemen and the Black community in Britain in the First World War. So Frank was born in 1897 in London. And educated at Cranley Boys Boarding School in Surrey, where he was one of the school's first Black pupils when he entered at the age of 13 in 1910. I tracked down the Cranley School archivist who let me use this photograph of Frank as a young man in my book, but he also told me that Frank was a successful sportsman at Cranley and was in the first 11 for football and cricket and was an honorary secretary of both sports. Those were the two major sports, and he was one of the two gymnasts who represented Cranley at the public school's gymnastic competition at Aldershot. He was also a corporal in the officers' training corps. The school magazine described him as a versatile member of the community, both academically and athletically. But upon leaving Cranley in July 1915, he was accepted to Merton College, Oxford, to read law, like his father wanted him to do, to follow in his father's footsteps. But Frank was called up for service in the British Army in November 1916 at the age of 19. And according to his his army service record, it described him as an excellent soldier, and he joined the Army Service Corps as a learner motor driver. And when he was transferred to the elite Royal Tank Corps, he initially served as a dispatch rider and was deployed to France in 1917, where he received the military medal for his bravery at the famous Battle of Cambrai. This was the first major breach of the German lines on the Western Front in over 3 years and has been described as one of the bloodiest battles of the First World War. So he survived the First World War, returned to Oxford to continue studying law, and while there he boxed for the university and also for Great Britain at the 1920 Olympic Games in Antwerp in Belgium. Frank continued to box while practicing as a barrister and was still winning Amateur Boxing Association divisional cruiserweight championships in 1945, by which time he was 47. He qualified as a barrister and during the Second World War served as an army officer. He married in 1919, had 3 children, but tragically died in 1957 at the age of 59 after being involved in a car accident in Wolverhampton. So very hard actually to find information on him. I had to dig a bit deep. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said about him. So he's as much, for me, a fascinating Black British figure as Evelyn. And the only photograph I could find of Frank and Evelyn together was the one that you can see now, taken probably during the Second World War. It looks to what they're wearing is Second World War. So Evelyn was educated privately and studied singing, piano and elocution at the Royal Academy of Music in London. I say London because I noticed some people are signing in from America, which is lovely, so they may not be familiar with all the London bits of the talk, so I'll emphasize London where I need to, so you know. As a trained contralto in the early 1920s, she hoped for a career on the concert platform, but this was almost impossible in Britain for a Black singer at that time. So Evelyn worked in London cabaret shows instead, and also the all-Black cast reviews of the jazz reviews that toured and eventually took her to Europe, where she was a sensation. So although she was doing well in Britain, as you can see, there is a photograph there of her singing spirituals. So she did continue to do the serious kind of classical type singing, but there were few and far opportunities. But most of the work that came her way, as you can see, was in the reviews, the jazz reviews, the all-Black shows that toured Britain and Europe. And she turned out to be very popular in Italy, of all places. She spent several years in Italy, where she proved to be enormously popular with audiences. And then, as I said earlier, in 1932, she traveled to Paris to replace the legendary Josephine Baker as the star attraction of the Casino Paris. Now, for the review, Evelyn wore Josephine's flimsy, revealing costume. Consequently, the prim and proper middle-class English girl scandalized her family, particularly her Sierra Leonean West African father, by appearing semi-naked on stage in Paris. And it was said that her respectable and straight-laced West African father disowned her. And certainly there doesn't seem to have been much of a close relationship between them until he died in London in 1949. Following her disappointing trip to New York in 1936, Evelyn took herself off to India in 1937, where she triumphed in cabaret at the popular Harbour Bay in Bombay, which is now known as Mumbai. One newspaper, the Evening News of India, introduced her as an artist of international reputation, one of the leading personalities of Europe's entertainment world, and the closest rival of the great Josephine Baker. So she was always being likened to Josephine Baker, maybe in some respects in her shadow, but certainly forged her path. The review of her cabaret show in Bombay was rapturous. Evelyn Dove is very easy on the eye with her splendid tall figure and her pleasant face and flashing eyes. Now, when Hitler's war clouds appeared over Europe, Evelyn couldn't go back to France or Italy because, as some of you will know, by 1940, those countries were either affiliated to Nazi Germany or occupied by Nazi Germany. Instead, she returned to Britain, and throughout World War II, she enjoyed the same appeal as the force's sweetheart, Vera Lynn. The BBC employed Evelyn all through the war, and and she proved to be one of BBC Radio's most popular singers, appearing in a wide range of music and variety programs. I did do some research at the BBC's written archives in Caversham, and looked at her files, huge files of her correspondence and contracts and things. And she did an awful lot of work for the BBC during the whole of the 1940s. Many of these appearances were broadcast to the forces, so she did her bit for the war effort by singing to the forces, the armed services, and while other appearances that she made could be heard on the BBC's West African and Caribbean airwaves. So that would have brought her into contact with the Jamaican feminist Una Marson, who was based at the BBC, was their first Black female producer, radio producer, and produced the Call in the West Indies series, in which Evelyn made occasional guest appearances during the war. In fact, I did my research, as early as 1925, Evelyn had the distinction of becoming, as far as we know, the first Black woman to sing on BBC Radio. BBC Radio started in 1922, and she's the earliest Black woman I can find to have sung on BBC Radio, and that was as early as 1925. Starting in 1939, for almost a decade, Evelyn made radio broadcasts, including over 50 editions of the series Serenade in Sepia, in which she was featured with the Trinidadian folk singer Edric Connor, who you can see in this lovely photograph from 1945. The series was so popular that in 1946, the BBC transferred it to their television service. So the television service of the BBC was interrupted during the war. Evelyn had actually made an appearance in 1938 in pre-war BBC television, but returned television service as we know it now, resumed in 1946. And within weeks, Evelyn and Edric became household names with their television series based on Serenade in Sepia. They were among Britain's first television stars in the early post-war years when the medium was still in its infancy. Regrettably, none of their appearances exist because television was live, transmitted live before technology was invented to make recordings of their television shows. So in the 1940s, Evelyn enjoyed another decade at the top of her profession, with numerous radio broadcasts, concert appearances, and by becoming the first Black woman to star in her own television series. A lot of achievements. But the following decade, the 1950s, tragically, her career took an unexpected downward turn. Work became scarce, and in 1955, when desperate for work, she applied to the post office in London for a job as a telephonist. I mean, unless you're Judi Dench, all artists have ups and downs in their careers, but it was sad to find that out, and I found that out in a letter that she wrote to the BBC asking for a reference. But even more humiliating was the fact that she had, this is what I was about to just said, but even more humiliating was the fact that she had to ask the BBC for a reference, and that letter still is in their file. In 1956, the tide began to turn when she landed an acting role on BBC television as Eartha Kitt's mother in the play Mrs. Patterson. This was a Broadway play, an American play that Eartha Kitt had had great success with in New York on Broadway, but it was adapted for British television in 1956. And when technology started to improve, the BBC did record it, and the recording does exist. It exists in the National Film Archive in the British Film Institute. So it's lovely to see Evelyn acting on television as Eartha Kitt's mother in this unusual play, but wonderful to see her on screen. And 2 years later, Evelyn was back on stage in London's West End as one of the stars of Langston Hughes's musical Simply Heavenly, and another import from America, from Broadway. And Evelyn then joined one of Britain's first Black theatre companies, the Negro Theatre Workshop, which was founded by her former co-star and his wife Pearl in 1961. The workshop staged its first major production, A Wreath for Udomo, in London in 1961, with a memorable cast that included, as you can see in this photograph, Earl Cameron at the centre, Lloyd Record, and Evelyn. The workshop also gave opportunities for a new generation of young Black British actors to learn their craft, including Rudolph Walker, who British television viewers will know as Patrick Truman in EastEnders, and Nina Baden-Semper. In 1965, Evelyn made one of her last stage appearances in the workshop's acclaimed production, The Dark Disciples, a blues version of the St. Luke Passion. And they toured that all over Britain, in town halls, in churches, St. Martin in the Fields Church in Trafalgar Square. They staged it wherever they could. They could never get the funding to have their own permanent base, which is what they wanted, but they would turn down. The story of the workshop is told in the book that I've written that Tony mentioned, Deep Are the Roots. Very, very sad, but it was a production that drew the attention of the BBC again and was televised on BBC television in 1966, but sadly they didn't keep a recording of it, so we are not able to see it. So by the end of the 1960s, Evelyn's star began to fade. She suffered from depression, and in 1972, at the age of 70, she was admitted to a nursing home in Epsom in Surrey. Now, in the 1950s, Evelyn had befriended a young singer and actress called Isabel Lucas. Now, this is a photograph of Isabel with a portrait of Evelyn. The portrait was done during the Second World War. Isabel was actually Canadian, came here in 1954 to study singing, and became very much part of the British acting scene, stage musicals for many decades. She was an absolutely lovely person. In the 1950s, Isabel befriended Evelyn, and one of Isabel's most famous roles, for those of you old enough to remember, she played Lenny Henry's mother in one of the first Black television sitcoms, The Fosters, back in the 1970s. So when I met Isabel for the first time in 1989 at her home, she lived in a beautiful home in Kingston upon Thames, she explained to me what had happened to Evelyn. She said, I felt very sorry for her because she had so much talent, so much to give. I stayed in touch with Evelyn until she died in 1987. She was still a lovely woman when she was old. I went to her funeral, but no one else did, apart from one or two members of staff from the home. It made me very sad. Now, when I walked into Isabel's home, I saw this portrait on the wall, and I'd never seen it before. And I said to Isabel, that's Evelyn Dove. And Isabel's face sort of lit up. This is 2 years after the funeral of Evelyn. I only heard on the grapevine that she had died. There were no obituaries for Evelyn in any newspapers. So Isabel was curious as to know what I knew about Evelyn. I didn't know very much at that time. This is 1989 in Isabel's home. So she pulled out this paper bag, big paper holdall bag, and it was full of photographs of Evelyn, including her scrapbook, the silver medal that you saw, the photographs which were really damaged. The photographs that you've seen this evening were all damaged. I had them digitally remastered so that they would look good when we did the book. And we just got talking about Evelyn, and Isabel filled in some of the gaps. And this was, as I say, 1989. And I then went off and did, with more clues, did more research on her. But what happened was kind of incredible, really, because no one knew who Evelyn was, apart from me and Isabel, in terms of her career, in terms of her impact. Isabel had suffered a massive heart attack in, I think it was 1996, thereabouts. And she phoned me. She said, Stephen, I'm ill. She said, I haven't got long. If anything happens to me, my husband will probably just throw all this stuff out. You know, we'll have a clear out. And I'm frightened that Evelyn's photographs and her memorabilia will end up in the bin. She said, would you come over and take it for me, take it away, because I know that you will look after it. And that was that. Isabel sadly died in 1997, I think it was, 1997, 1998. And I had this bag of memorabilia, Evelyn Dove photographs, and I didn't know really what to do with it. A book was furthest from my mind. And then some of you may have heard of a Black British women's publishing house called Jacaranda. And Jacaranda contacted me. It's run by a wonderful woman called Valerie Brandes. She's now featured in this week's issue of The Bookseller, a Black British, a British magazine called the Bookseller, but it's devoted this whole issue, the 20th of May issue, to Black writers, to Black literature, including an interview with Valerie. Valerie's and Jacaranda Books have gone from strength to strength. So it was intriguing that they contacted me and said, would you come visit our office and talk to us? And there were about 3 Black women running this publishing house in an office in London. And they said, we love your work. We've read Black Poppies. We think you're great, which is nice. It's nice to get praise. Have you got any ideas? And I don't know why I thought of Evelyn. I said, well, I've got all these photographs of Evelyn. So we had another meeting. I took all the photographs, or some of the photographs with me, and they commissioned the book, and the book was published in 2016. So that would have been about 18 years. I'm not very good at maths, 18 years after Isabel had passed on and passed this information on to me. And it was almost like it was destiny. It was meant to be. That's how it felt when I wrote the book. Not an easy book to write, because the lack of information and you know, to publish a book like this, you need a lot of information to fill the pages. Otherwise, it isn't a viable product for the publisher. But with all the wonderful pictures, I know I'm enticing you to go out and buy it. I hope you do. For Evelyn, not for me. And for Jacaranda to support I think one of the few Black publishers that we have in Britain, so go out and support them as well and look at their website, because they've published some amazing book. That's my plug and my big up for Jacaranda. But they made it possible. If they hadn't made it possible, I know that white publishers in this country would not have entertained a book on Evelyn. It would have been very difficult. And so we launched the book, guess where? At the Royal Academy of Music. We managed to, without too much difficulty, to persuade the wonderful Royal Academy of Music. I'd never been there, but to stand in the Royal Academy of Music in 2016, that's what, 6 years ago, and launch this book. And, you know, so I don't know how it happened, maybe Twitter, maybe Facebook, social media. It's beyond me sometimes, but so many family members, most of whom had never met each other, as you can see from the photograph, of different generations. They brought babies, they brought children, they brought toddlers, they brought elderly people, and they were all connected in some way to Evelyn, but didn't know the story. They knew they had this famous singer in their family somewhere. So it was, as you can see from that photograph, a very emotional, moving tribute that I gave an illustrated talk, played some of her music. I apologize for not being able to play some of her music. I'm not technically very good at doing all that multimedia stuff. But if you go on YouTube and type in Evelyn Dove, some of her songs, she didn't make that many recordings, but you can find some of her music, some of her recorded songs on YouTube. So that was a fantastic night. And since then, I'm proud to say, hand on heart, her name has now become more familiar. So in the corner, you can see a couple of pages from her scrapbook, which I loaned to the BBC for their centenary. The BBC have a website 100 years of the BBC, because this year is the centenary, and they wanted to highlight Evelyn. So there are other pages on the website about Evelyn. So I let them photograph the scrapbook and put it on there. So you can look for that. There's a underground train map that has been dedicated. All the London Underground stations have been renamed in the honour of famous women from British history. And if you look on the central line, the red line, you can see Audrey Hepburn, who I adore, and Evelyn Dove is next to her. So if you don't get off at Audrey Hepburn, stay on the train to Evelyn Dove and you're there. Amazing. And then that she was a I can't say it, Google Doodle. I don't quite know what that means, but it was lovely to see her on Google being doodled for her centenary. That would have been that it was for 120th birth or whatever. And then Alexandra Palace, which is where she made Serenade in Sepia on television in 1946 and actually made her first television appearance in 1938. Alexandra Palace is in North London. There's Una Marson, who I mentioned at the BBC microphone, and in the centre, at the far end, Winifred Atwell. You just see a little bit of Winifred Atwell from Trinidad, who was a big star here in the 1950s. And in the middle, in a yellow dress, is Evelyn, her portrait painted by an artist. Forgive me, I forgot to look up the name of the artist. If anyone knows, they can put it in the chat bar. But absolutely amazing that Evelyn has now getting the recognition that she deserves. And I've been very proud and honoured to be part of that. So just to finish, I would say that in the 1920s and 30s, many African-American expatriates settled in Europe: Josephine Baker, Adelaide Hall, Elizabeth Welsh, and many others. They captivated audiences with their songs, their beauty, their elegance and style. Evelyn stood out alone as a Black Briton who joined these trailblazers. They were women who created a glamorous new image for Black women in show business, far removed from the bandana-wearing mammy. Evelyn Dove was a trailblazer who was ahead of her time, forging new barriers and facing up to her own personal struggles, and with determination and defiance, her spirit remains alive in all of us. And just to conclude, the book that Tony recommended at the beginning, Deep Are the Roots, is my most recent publication. And that has now recently been shortlisted for the Society for Theatre Research Theatre Book Prize. And that will be announced on the 9th of June, the winner. The judges had over 50 theatre books submitted for consideration. Can you imagine reading over 50 books? I love books, but 50, goodness. And I was shortlisted with Deep Are the Roots, trailblazers who changed Black British theatre. So Evelyn is not in that book. I mean, there might be a brief mention here and there because I'd already written the biography, but you'll find out the stories of many, many, many people, including Edric and Pearl Connor. And then finally, my last slide is my website. If any of you want to explore the 30 years of Black British history and many other books I've written, I invested in a brand new website last year, and I think it looks pretty amazing. I can't claim credit for it. It was designed by someone who knows far more about these things than I do. Tony, I'll end there. I'm happy to take questions if you want to ask them on behalf of the people that have attended, but I thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, no problem. You can have a look at the chat while I'm talking to you, but
okay.
First question I'm going to ask you is, for those of us who don't really appreciate World War II, can you tell us a bit about the importance of people like Dame Vera Lynn, and exactly what were they doing during World War II, which made them so well-loved, so popular, and indeed so necessary? And then that will help us to understand Evelyn Dove's role.
It was lifting the spirits and the morale of the British public. In America, America entered the war in December 1941. But in America, on the home front, the women and children and the people that stayed at home were not a bomb. They weren't bombed, but the women and children and the people that stayed at home in Britain were. And while other people, men and women, were off fighting in the war in the armed services. So they paid the singers and the entertainers, not just on BBC Radio, but in troop shows for the troops. Evelyn was part of that. Many, many Black artists, the two that I mentioned, Elizabeth Welch and Adelaide Hall, were all part of that generation of entertainers, Black and white, who in Britain entertained the troops, entertained the British public. And Evelyn was part of that. So it was a morale booster, helping to lift the spirits of the public, the British public, and the service people who were under fire, who were in danger, whose lives could end at any time with the bombing of our cities. And my dad, in fact, I asked my dad back in the 1990s, he's passed away now, but I said to him, just out of curiosity, do you remember the name Evelyn Dove? Oh yeah, he said, I've not heard that name in years. He said, she used to sing on the radio. So that she was known as a name. He didn't know anything about her. He just knew her as this beautiful singer on the radio, like Vera Lynn and many others. And she was part of that mix. Very, very important and very, very inspiring for people to hear those voices coming over the airwaves at a time when their lives were all at risk.
So Evelyn Dove and Adelaide Hall were kind of traveling around Britain, also singing at BBC, entertaining people while they were being bombed to keep their spirits, to help them keep fighting during the war. And that's why they were being paid by the authorities to actually keep the spirits up. Is that right?
Yeah, that it was their careers. So Adelaide and Evelyn would have been too old for active service, so they would have gone off. I mean, Adelaide, I knew Adelaide very well. I knew her person. I didn't know Evelyn, but I knew Adelaide. And Adelaide told me that she joined ENSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association. Now, she's an African-American expatriate. She didn't go back to America when the war broke out. She stayed here. Her nightclub in Mayfair, the old Florida Club, was bombed. It was flattened in the war. So she had to carry on her career with ENSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association. And she's told me once for example, she sang an open air concert in, I think it was Regent's Park, big park in London, famous park, and to hundreds of troops, like soldiers and sailors and all these people. And the air raid siren went. And she said that you either had to stop singing and go to the shelter or just carry on. And she just carried on until the Nazi planes, the bombers came too close, and then they had to duck for cover. I mean, a lot of Americans came here as well, as you know. Glenn Miller was killed when his plane went down over the English Channel. They never found his body. So a lot of Americans came to Britain as well. Glenn Miller, the orchestra leader, to entertain the American troops as well as the British troops. So they did risk their lives, absolutely.
Actually, can you just mention just briefly Ken Sneerkips Johnson and what happened to him? Briefly, if you don't mind.
Briefly, Ken's story is in my book, Under Fire, Black Britain in Wartime. So I'll plug my book, Under Fire, if I may. But Ken was Guyanese. He was from what was then known as British Guyana, now known as Guyana. And he was a young lad that came here in the 1930s and formed the first Black British swing band, not jazz. He's often referred to as a jazz band, but it was a swing band. There is a difference. And he conducted the orchestra. He was hugely popular on the radio, in the Café de Paris nightclub. And in 1941, a bomb, like with Adelaide, although Adelaide wasn't at her club when it was bombed, unfortunately, Ken was at the Café de Paris, one of the most famous swanky nightclubs in London at the time. And in March the 8th, 1941, a stick of bombs during an air raid while Ken was performing on stage. One of the bombs went down the air shaft into the nightclub and killed many people, including Ken. He was only 26 years old, but he had really broken through. I suppose at the time, he was one of the most famous Black men in Britain, really,
wow.
The biggest names.
Wow, amazing. Oh, speaking of venues, I mean, do you know where Evelyn Dove lived in London? And do you know some of the venues she performed at in London?
Too complicated to go into now. I do have that information in the book, but she lived all over London. She was a bit of a traveller. She never really had a permanent home base, but I've got references to addresses all over London. Her last address in London before she went to the nursing home in Surrey was, I think it was in Blackheath, near Greenwich, up that way.
You got a question from Rosemary. She says, why weren't any family members present at Evelyn's funeral? Do you know why there was an estrangement?
Yes, I do. 1958, she became involved. She married an African American who was in the army, I think, and based here. And he was much younger. She was hoping to go back to America with him, but the American forces wouldn't allow it. So he was packed off back to America. She never saw him again. And she had, I don't know, I wasn't there. I don't know that part of her family because they'd all passed on, but it looks as though she just faded away. She did have her sister-in-law, Frank's wife, Amelia, as her next of kin in 1972 when she entered the nursing home. And Isabel told me that Amelia was the only family member that remained in contact, but Amelia died in the 1970s. So once Amelia had died, the nursing home, I don't think, took it upon themselves to try and trace Amelia's. I've now met Amelia and Frank's descendants, and they've explained that Evelyn just sort of vanished. She's just sort of faded away, even from the family, not just from the public view, but from the family. So that by the time she died in 1987, Isabel said no one was visiting her except me, that there was no one left. I met younger members of the family, because it's not my place to point finger. They've said that if they'd known, those that were old enough to have known her, they would have made an effort to find her and visit her. But she was just this mysterious figure from their past, their family past, and that's what happens sometimes in families. It's sad.
It seems like there's at least 2 Dove members of family in the chat or in online right now. They've said a few words in the chat box. So
it's that some have come forward and made themselves known to me, but it's just a miracle, an absolute miracle, that all these photographs have survived. Because if Isabel hadn't gone back to the home, what happened was, Isabel told me that after the funeral, they scattered her ashes, and then, or maybe scattered her ashes at another time, but Isabel went back to the nursing home and said, where are Evelyn's costumes? Or she kept all her beautiful stage costumes, photographs, and they said they'd thrown out all the stage costumes, had gone, but all what was left was this bag, this paper bag, big paper bag, like a holdall of photographs and her scrapbook, and that's all that survived. And Isabel was gutted. Isabel told me that she was so hurt that they would throw away all her wonderful stage costumes. She didn't even have any of her 78 records in the bag. I've actually collected them, bought them off eBay. I've got like a complete set now. She didn't make many recordings, only about 7 or 8 recordings, discs from 1939 to 1940. She wasn't a prolific recording artist, but I managed to find them all, find a list of all her recordings and find the discs. As I say, some of them are on YouTube anyway. But very it really saddened Isabel that the home would have done such a thing.
And this, I suppose, if it wasn't for your book, then we'd have a massive gap when it comes to this amazing woman's career.
Yes, because as I say, I honestly don't think we have very few. You can count on one hand, and I'm sure, Tony, you would agree with me, the number of Black publishers we have in this country.
Yeah.
But you can count on one hand the number of Black literary editors that we have, in this country. We're nowhere near where we should be. America, it's different. In Britain, the majority of publishers are white and middle class. And I don't think for 1 minute any of them would have published this book. I mentioned Elizabeth Welch. I wrote a book about her, but I had to go to an American publisher to publish the biography of Elizabeth Welch, because no publisher in this country would touch it. I've always had to confront this problem in this country, but it was a miracle that Jacaranda came to me and said, have you got any ideas? Well, I didn't at the time have any strong ideas, but I just found myself talking about Evelyn. It was almost
spiritual.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a great believer in such things, but who am I to judge? Maybe it was guidance happening beyond me, but it almost seemed inevitable that this book would come out, but it took a Black women's publishing house to do it, and good for them.
Yeah, you got a couple of questions about the BBC. Now, that could be a bit controversial, but the questions are, how come the BBC has lost or misled or destroyed this kind of valuable archive of Evelyn Dove and other characters from history?
They didn't. No, to be fair to the BBC, they didn't have the technology to record. Television was unrecordable. It was live transmission until the 1950s, when they started to experiment, and videotape, as we understand it, didn't come into existence until the 1960s. Yes, you're right. I mean, the BBC did video record lots of classic programs and then wipe them. But that's another story. That didn't affect Evelyn. Evelyn was around very early on, and there was no, I mean, although the BBC could record some programs off radio, sadly none of Evelyn's survived, but that wasn't a conscious decision. It was just, they could only record a certain fraction of their output. It is sad, but when you go to the written archives, the BBC's written archives in Caversham, just outside London, near Reading, it's shocking really, because they've kept every scrap of paper, every script. You can find every script of Evelyn's radio programs. Usually they're just a list of the songs that she was going to sing. I've got some of them. Scripts of plays, scripts, correspondence between the agent and the artist and the BBC. Some, as I say, Evelyn's files, there's several files, are massive. They're fascinating to read, but the BBC were meticulous, absolutely meticulous at keeping every scrap of paperwork, which is now available for researchers. You can go there and research it. But you have to do it by appointment and trek up to Reading outside London. But it's there, but the programme sadly, but about 2 television programmes of Evelyn's do survive, the Mrs. Patterson with Eartha Kitt, and then Evelyn was in the BBC television version of The Green Pastures, famous American play from 1930 with an all-Black cast. And it's amazing to watch it, because it's although it's supposed to be set in America, the accents, you've got Trinidad, you've got Barbados, you've got Jamaica, you've got West African, you've got Evelyn with her English middle class. The casting of this play in 1958 of all the Black actors that were around at the time was incredible. And it was, again, live, like Mrs. Patterson. It was transmitted live, and it was a 2-hour production, huge production, very difficult to see. You can view it, I think, at the BBC. I don't, but I've only ever seen it once, but it was quite an amazing experience.
Right, so there's your book on Evelyn Dove, which is the book on Evelyn Dove. Do you know of any kind of documentaries or radio shows that have been focused on her and her life story?
I made one. I made an Evelyn Dove radio program in 1993 for the BBC. I did a series, and I included Evelyn. Now, I only just discovered in April last month, somebody's posted it on YouTube. So you can do it on YouTube, but it doesn't come up under the title of the series. It comes up, I think, under Evelyn Dove, but it's a very poor recording, 1993. But you will get to hear her sing, and you'll hear my script being, and Moira Stewart presents it. It's a lovely program. I'm very proud of it. It's about 15 minutes long, but the sound quality is a little bit slow. It slows down the voices and makes them sound deeper than they already are. But I have tried since to do another program on Evelyn for Radio 3, but didn't want to know.
Right. Can you just remind us of your website, please? What is your website, please, Stephen? So we can all go and buy your books.
www dot Stephen Bourne, all one word, Stephen with a PH, stephenbourne.co.uk. Or if you just go to Google and type in Stephen Bourne, it usually comes up, but it's www.stephenbourne.co.uk. And if you click on books, all my books, well, most of them.
And just out of interest, of course, there's been some increase in interest in this type of history in the last couple of, or 2 years to be precise.
Yeah.
Have you found yourself more in demand? Have you been approached to do documentaries or do commissions on this type of history, on Evelyn Dove and others like her?
I would say on balance, as much as we all hated COVID, it made my life easier in so far as online talks like we do now. Now, I believe there are some Americans online listening to this, which is fantastic. That wouldn't have happened before COVID, because I would go out to a library or an archive or wherever it was, National Portrait Gallery, and give the talk live. And so now COVID has forced us to do all this. Not always. I did a talk last Saturday at a conference in Bristol. I went in person, but it's. I'm sorry. What was your question, Tony?
Question was: have you been approached or more often?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. It's been wonderful because I've done lots and lots and lots of online talks. I've done more radio interviews for the BBC this year than I've ever done in any other year. I did an Ira Aldridge program, Great Lives with Lolita Chakrabarti a couple of months ago. Fabulous program. I was really thrilled to be in it. That was Radio 4. I talked about Avril Coleridge-Taylor, Samuel's Coleridge-Taylor's daughter, in a BBC Radio 3 program. It's last year I took part in a British jazz series on, I think it was Jazz FM, Clive Myrie from Mastermind. And reading the news, he hosted the series. So yes, I television less so, but radio more so. And the good news is that in addition to the nomination for the award for Deep Other Roots, which I'm thrilled about, in September the children's version of Black Poppies is being published with a different cover. So I've adapted this book, Black Poppies for Children, and Evelyn and Frank are in it.
Oh wow.
They are included, although I've written about them in the adult version, because my feeling is now that we cannot wait any longer to push Black British history in the schools, in the primary schools, in the secondary schools. And teachers want to know, but there's no history books, Black British history books for children. There are story books about Windrush. My grandma was on the Windrush. There's lots of story books about the Windrush. There's David Olusoga's Black and British, he adapted for children. So there's a few, but there's not enough. And teachers are crying out because they're being criticised for not teaching Black British history or favouring African American history over Black British history. So they teach young people about Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and African American civil rights at the expense of our Black British history. And that should continue because those African American figures are iconic. But we need to balance it with the Black British stories, with people like Evelyn, her brother Frank, so on and so forth. There's hundreds. And we're not doing it. So my Black Poppies for Children will come out in September and hopefully go some way to fill in that gap and get used in schools.
Can you confirm that Evelyn Dove performed at Adelaide Hall's nightclub in Mayfair? Do you think that happened?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I have no evidence of that at all. I don't. They worked together in 1925 in a American review that went to Russia and other sort of places in Europe, but they weren't close friends. They weren't enemies or that, but they led their own. They led their own lives. But no.
You got a question here. What's your next passion project, and why are you interested in Black history?
Well, as I explained, I've kind of jumped the gun with that one. The Black Poppies for Children is coming out in September, and I want to really push that one. But that book will also include the very first chapter, the story of my adopted Aunt Esther, who I've written about a lot in the past, but she was a Black Londoner born before the First World War. So she was a child during the First World War and adopted into my family in the Second World War. And the time I was born, she was part of my family. And then in 1991, my very first book, or Black British history book, was Aunt Esther's life story, which was a joy to do because she was still alive, and I'd been interviewing her for years and collecting her stories, which were amazing. So that she kind of introduced me to the idea of Black British history, that there was a Black presence here. And back in 1991, to be honest, we'd never heard of Windrush. I'd never heard of Windrush. Windrush wasn't on the landscape. Some people had heard of it. There had been some recognition in 1988, the 40th anniversary of Windrush.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until 1998, the 50th anniversary, that Windrush books started to get published.
Yeah.
And we started to realise it. But then the side effect of that was everyone believed that Black people came here after Windrush.
Yeah.
So those of us who knew about the pre-war, the pre-Windrush history, started to get very frustrated.
Cool. All right, I think we're kind of come to the end of our little conversation here.
Thank you. It's been a joy to share the story of Evelyn.
Indeed. I mean, amazing story. And I like the photographs too. I mean, you did a really good job to keep those photographs intact and, you know.
Well, I haven't got a clue how to digitally remaster. I can't even say the word properly. Digitally remaster. A friend of mine did that. And he got paid, as he should be, because he did a fantastic job. But these photographs, the originals, are in a very poor condition. But I'm glad I've got digitally remastered versions of them. I had to have it done for the book, but it was a joy to do because they are beautiful photographs. But it would be nice to have them seen more widely.
Absolutely. All right, so your website is stephenbourne.co.uk.
Yes.
Some of your 20 odd, 25 odd books from that website. We'll probably have another session with you, Stephen, in a couple of months' time to do looking at the new Black Poppies children's version.
Oh, the children's version.
Yeah, why not?
September.
Let's do it. September.
You can be the official launch.
Oh, nice one. Yeah, I'll do that.
You want to do that?
Yeah, cool, man. Let's do it.
But we won't have glasses of wine and crisps.
No, unless you're paying for that.
I don't drink, but I'll have a glass of fizzy water and some crisps at the side. And you'll have to when you advertise it on Eventbrite, Tony, you have to ask everyone to bring their own wine, crisps, and we'll do an official book launch. That would be I would be honoured to do that with you. I tell you,
no problem.
I'm not going on that boat. I'm terrified of going on. Don't ask me to do it on the boat because unless the boat's stationary.
we can make it happen, man.
It looks fantastic, but thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who came. It was lovely.
No problem. So this is going to switch off in about literally 5 minutes. In the meantime, you can have a look at the chat box or say goodbye, exchange numbers, whatever. But please check out our website, blackhistorywatch.co.uk, for other such events in the next couple of months. Goodbye for now, and thank you.